Paul, one of the characteristics of God is that God is omniscient. That means, supposedly, that God knows everything. What does it mean to know everything? The more I think about that, the more that looks impossible. So let's start with something simple like the future. Does God know the future? And if God knows the future, how is that possible?
Well, first of all, I think we have to say what God does know quite clearly. And I would say that God knows everything that has happened and everything that is happening. We don't, of course. Our vision is very limited. We only see things in fragments. A picture from the Bible about this is of a God who sees everything and tests everything with God's eyes. So this idea that God knows all that is happening in the world and has happened in the world seems a very important part of the notion of the omniscience of God. But then you've asked the question, does also God know what is going to happen in the future? And I would say, no, God does not know that in detail. Now, this is because God wants the world to be free, to make its own decisions, to do new things in cooperation with God. And if God knew the future in detail, it would be closed and determined. And so God has limited God's self to give us freedom to be truly partners in God's world and God's creation. But it doesn't mean that we know the future or don't know the future in the same way that God does, because God knows all the possibilities there are in human life. And therefore, God has an understanding of where human lives are going, the kind of direction they're moving in. In that sense, God certainly knows the future. And God also knows the power of God's own love. And this means that God knows that God will bring about the overcoming of evil and the bringing of everything together into reconciliation. We don't have that certainty, though we can have that hope. So I would say that, yes, God does know the future. You might say in outline, because God knows what the end will be. But what about the content of that end? What does it look like? Well, that depends radically on how we cooperate with God and work together with God to bring that about.
Okay, let's go into that. Yeah. First of all, you said that God self-limits God's self. Does that mean it is possible for God to know the future in detail, in all its detail, but God chooses not to do it to enable our freedom? Or is it impossible for God to know that?
Well, God is the God whom God has determined to be. Yes. God's being springs out of God's own will and desire. Who is the God that God desires to be? God desires to be the kind of creator who gives creation freedom to be itself.
If God desired
to work together. So it isn't possible to say, well, could God have been something else? Could God have known the future but has chosen not to? I would say the self-limitation of God as creator in bringing this creation into being in partnership with God means that God does not know the future in detail, because that's part of the meaning of a free creation. And it's a pure hypothesis to ask, well, could God have been something else?
In Christian tradition, there are many answers to this question. And let me give you two on the extremes. One says that not only does God know the future, but God predetermines the future. God sets the future in terms of everyone's salvation and everything else. So that's a predeterminism. Others say that God does know the future and comes up with some elaborate, some would say tortured, others would say creative ways how God could know the future, but still enable our freedom. God is in a timeless dimension and we're in a time dimension. There are some other sophisticated ways that God can know the future and still protect our creaturely freedom, so to speak. How do you look upon those attempts to reconcile traditional doctrine with reality?
Yes, this is the attempt, as it were, to distinguish God's foreknowledge from some kind of predetermination. To say that God certainly knows the future in complete detail, but doesn't determine it, because created beings are able to make their own decisions. It's just that God lives in a timeless existence and therefore sees, as it were, every moment of history in one instantaneous flash. And so God can see the future but doesn't determine the future, certainly not in detail. I don't find that at all satisfactory. I mean, I understand why people would want to say that, and for at least two reasons. First of all, it seems to me that if God knows exactly what I'm going to do tomorrow and sees it in, as it were, one timeless, simultaneous moment, then actually I can't do anything else.
Because God can't be wrong.
Yes,
if God believes that.
Exactly. The observation of that, even in a timeless moment, has in fact fixed it. Now, philosophers, of course, would want to argue about that, but to me that seems to be cogent. And so I think foreknowledge and predetermination belong together. The second reason is that why should we think of God living in a totally timeless existence? Clearly, God isn't limited by time in the way that we are. God is not broken up by time as we are, when we often, as it were, allow the regrets of the past to overwhelm us, or we try and disappear into the future in wish fulfillment dreams. The person is broken in time. God is not like that. God lives harmoniously with time and with many time scales in the universe, because time is relative to space. There isn't just one time scale. God is the master of time. God walks all the paths of time without being limited by any of them. So it isn't that God is constrained in time as we are. One theologian has said that time is in God rather than God in time. But if God were completely timeless, it's very difficult to think of God entering human history and taking human history seriously. It would all be a kind of shadow play, a puppet play, if time were not in some sense real for God, though not in the same way as for us. So for those two reasons, I don't think that we can simply distinguish foreknowledge from predetermination. The one does mean the other.
The charge of certain theologians against you would be that what you are doing is allowing the possibility for God's providence, the capacity for God to make sure that the world proceeds on God's plan, that everyone is properly saved, is somewhat in doubt.
Well, it depends whether you think that suffering love is the strongest power in the universe. God doesn't act coercively in God's own creation, but always in partnership, always in cooperation with the reality that God has created. How can we know that this will end in the reconciliation of all things and the overcoming of evil? Well, only if love is in fact the strongest power there is. We often think of power in very worldly terms, of the ability to make others do what we want them to do. But the Christian view is that the strongest power there is the transforming power of love. This is a kind of hazard that Christians have taken, that love is the strongest power in the universe. And that's the only certainty that we have, that a God who relates to the world in this way will bring about the final fulfillment of God's purpose within creation.